Good morning, everyone. It's Trevor Moffat here from the Improvement Service, and I'm joined this morning by Andy Kinnaird from the Scottish Government for this morning's webinar on the Planning Act implementation. We'll just go through some quick housekeeping for today. This morning's session is going to last about an hour. The first half hour or so will be 30 minutes of presentation from Andy, followed by a Q&A session. We won't be able to take your questions apart from using the questions tab on the right hand side of your screen. You should see a pop-up menu. If you can type questions in there, we will monitor them and ask them during the session at the end. You can type them in at any time, so please just put them in. We will be monitoring them as we go along. If we can ask you to keep the questions concise as possible, just so we can get through as many as we can during the half-hour slot. If you have any issues with sound or anything else during the webinar, please also put that in the question section, and we shall do our best to resolve any issues. I shall now pass you over to Andy, who will begin the first part of our session.
Okay, thanks Trevor, and good morning everyone. Thanks for tuning in. We're into 2020 now. This is going to be a massive year for planning in Scotland for lots of different reasons. This morning I'm going to talk through what's happening next to shape our planning system following on from the new Planning Act. But meanwhile, work is also underway in the preparation of Scotland's fourth National Planning Framework, which will carry a new enhanced status coming from the Act, and it will shape the future direction for development across Scotland over the next 3 decades. At the Scottish Government, we're mindful that we're taking that forward and asking all of you to help shape this future, while also having your own priorities to progress in your authorities and your agencies. So I'll use this session to try to give an update of our work programme and our approach to speaking with you and many others, and be happy to take any feedback on what you have to say. Sorry, not a techie issue there. So here's what I'm going to try to cover in the next half hour or so. There's plenty in there, so I'm going to skim over some of the content, but we can pick up on anything afterwards. And you're also welcome to contact me later if there's anything you want to talk through. So I'll just give a brief recap of how we got here through the review of planning and then the planning bill, bringing us to the new Act that we now have before us. I'll talk about the next steps and our approach to what is a heavy work programme. A run through of what the various provisions in the Act mean and what needs to happen to implement them. I'll mention some of the things that we're asking people to keep in mind as we drill down into the detailed processes and changes to the system. I'll flag up what you can do to make sure you keep up with progress as everything gathers pace. And I'll make sure I leave enough time for you to ask any questions or clarifications. Just want to say that at this point, there's still plenty to do to shape the new planning system, working within the structure set in the new Act, and I don't pretend to have all the answers yet, but maybe collectively between us we all do. So while any questions are very welcome, please do also feel free just to put over any opinions or ideas that we could be thinking about. So with the time we have, I don't want to dwell too long on the whole backstory to how we got here, but just in short, September 2015, Scottish ministers appointed an independent panel of users of the planning system to carry out a wide review. Then in May 2016, the panel reported, making a series of 48 recommendations for change across the whole planning system, while also reaching this overall conclusion that the system was not broken, but that it could be improved with a commitment to change practices and culture and with a focus on improvement. We followed the panel's work with an intensive period of stakeholder engagement, including 2 public consultations, analysis, thinking and rethinking, and then the drafting of legislation which ultimately became the Planning Scotland Bill. These 6 priority outcomes that are up on screen just now, they were identified through the review and were our main focus guiding our approach to planning reform. They're the key themes driving the legislative changes that we proposed in the bill, and we kept our focus on them in our handling of the bill's passage through the Scottish Parliament. And these 6 remain our key focus now as we get into the detail and the reshaping of the inner workings of the planning system through all the regulations and guidance that's still to come. So here we have it. We have a new Planning Act. The bill was in the Scottish Parliament for a year and a half, which isn't normal, and it had quite a rough ride along the way. It was heavily amended by the Local Government and Communities Committee at stage 2, and then after a 7-month gap was substantially amended again before being passed by the full Parliament last June. So the outcome from that is an Act that's been influenced by interests across the parties of the Scottish Parliament, including a number of new provisions and requirements that were not in the Government's original proposals. But we do think we've come out of the parliamentary process in a strong position with a package of reforms that will improve how planning is done for years to come. There's too much in the new Act to be able to cover off all of it in just one slide, and I'll pick up on much of this in a few moments. So this slide is just a summary of the main headlines which collectively set out the package of reforms. So we have some entirely new provisions, such as the purpose of planning, a statutory role for chief planning officers, and a power for communities to prepare their own local place plans. There are some substantial changes within the development planning system, a new status and procedure for a reshaped national planning framework, a different role and influence for regional planning, and a restructured process and new requirements for LDPs. The Act also gives planning authorities a new, or may call it improved, facility to lead and shape future development within master plan consent areas, building on the little used simplified planning zone tool. And there's a fairly wide range of changes to come for development management around things like pre-application consultation, the duration of planning permissions, also embedding the agent of change principle into legislation, and new powers to designate short-term control areas. Quality and performance in planning, clearly linked with the need for appropriate resourcing of planning services, has remained an important theme throughout the review, and work on that is moving forward right now, as I'm sure you'll be aware. And a theme running through the new Act and the changes to come is the need to ensure effective engagement with local communities and other stakeholders. So there's a lot of changes to come. What the Act has done in many areas is enabled Parliament to set the structure for our new planning system. But the detailed processes for much of this are still to be worked out. The Act places lots of requirements for the Scottish ministers to make a whole series of regulations and to produce and publish statutory guidance before so many strands of the reform package can take effect. So what we have on screen just now, again, involves some of the headlines of what is still to be done before we can bring much of the new legislation into force. We're also very much aware that we'll need to progress these at the same time as priority work to produce NPF4 and potential changes to permitted development rights, and also at the same time as we're working up a new digital strategy and taking forward its implementation. So not only does this have huge resource impacts on our own team at Scottish Government, but of course we'll also be engaging with the same group of stakeholders on many aspects of this, so there are implications here for everyone. And that's why we produced the Transforming Planning Practice Work Programme. I'll go on to that now. So this programme, we set out a phased scheduling of the work still to be done to implement the new Act, alongside other aspects of the wider reform package, rather than trying to do everything at once. So our plan is to have most of the Act implemented by the end of next year, with just a couple of outstanding elements going into the following year. You might notice on screen the dark line running down this chart. That represents the period over the next Scottish Parliament election when we're unable to make progress on legislation. So that focuses minds, and there are a few items we're aiming to get completed before the election period gets underway. And there are a few elements of the overall package that are top of the list too. So we've been needing to get the bill completed so that we can crack on with NPF4. That's now underway. You might have spotted a recent call for ideas. And we're now on the verge of launching a series of engagement events around the country. You'll hear of that in the next few days. The first of our consultations is live at the moment, looking to follow up on our commitment to revisit and increase fees, maintaining that link to system performance. There are 3 weeks left in that consultation. We're also prioritising the provisions for short-term let control areas, which we know is a pressing issue in some parts of the country. There are a number of elements grouped together in a community engagement package that we also want to move on at pace. And separate from the new Act, we also have a live consultation for another few days at least on a programme of reviewing PD rights. And on top of all of that, there are some elements of the new Act that don't need anything else done other than just to bring them into force. So we've already done some of that where we can. This slide here is just another illustration of how we're taking the programme forward through a series of work packages. So everything above that first line is work that's underway. Everything below it is going to be coming a bit later. And while we're asking for views about future PD changes, there are a few issues that have been prioritised to look at early on PD. So developments that could help with the response to climate change. A review of PD for hill tracks was an issue during the passage of the bill. Developments that could support the rural economy, and our promised look again at digital infrastructure. All things will be moving on at an early stage. So there are some parts of the Act now in force. Some of that has just been setting up the regulation-making powers for further work that's still to come. Among other notable commencements, we were delighted to be able to bring the new statutory purpose of planning into force on the World Town Planning Day, along with the provisions that have allowed us to get started on NPF4. And we can now proceed towards the appointment of the first National Planning Improvement Coordinator, which we intend to do around the same time as the changes to fees in the summer. The Agent of Change provision came into effect in December, requiring particular consideration to be given to noise-sensitive developments. And enforcement conviction fines are going up, although that won't feed through for a while yet. And also just worth flagging up, there are a few development management provisions coming into force at the start of March, including removing the need for full council decisions in some major cases. So a big question here. Over the last few months, when I've been talking about the new Act, I've tried to tailor what I've said to cover the parts of the Act of interest to the particular audience. I think, though, given the people we have tuned in this morning, it really is all of it. I'm going to do a run through now of the key provisions in the Act, roughly in the order they appear in the Act. I'm not going to cover everything in detail because we just won't have time for that, but please do just fire in any questions if there are things you'd like to raise or ask me to clarify. So right at the top of the Act is a new purpose of planning to manage the development and use of land in the long-term public interest. As I mentioned, that's now in force. It applies to our work on the NPF and also to all the provisions in the development planning part of the 1997 Act, so also including regional spatial strategies and open space strategies. As well as recognising contribution to sustainable development as being in the long-term public interest, the Act also future-proofs the purpose by tying it into the national outcomes in the other NPF, the National Performance Framework, which can change over time. Planning authorities already tend to have someone in post who's recognised as their Chief Planning Officer. This statutory role is about ensuring recognition for the vital contribution and influence of planning and leading the development of good places and the benefits that has for society as a whole, and having that influence when important decisions are being made. We're required to issue guidance on the role of the Chief Planning Officer, and we'll do that by the end of this year. And of course, we'll work closely with the profession and with local government in putting all of that together. The Act also enables ministers, but doesn't require them, to produce guidance on appropriate qualifications and experience for Chief Planning Officers. We're not convinced we need to do that guidance, but we can pick that up in the discussions that are still to come. NPF4 is going to look and feel very different to its predecessors, partly because the Act gives it status as part of the development plan, and it will also be combined with the SPP. During the planning bill process, there had been a fair bit of debate about particular policy priorities to be embedded in the legislation as requirements for the NPF. And that now includes 6 high-level outcomes that development should contribute to, relating to housing needs, improving health, rural population, equality and discrimination, climate change targets, and biodiversity. And there's a requirement for us to take account of a whole range of other national plans and strategies to help with coordination and promote consistency, along with a power to seek information from authorities to support NPF preparation. A very substantial procedural change for the NPF is that it will need to be approved by the Scottish Parliament before it can be adopted by ministers. So it will go to Parliament twice. First of all, as a consultation for up to 120 days, and then later to seek approval from Parliament. And consistent with LDPs, the NPF will be moving to a 10-year review cycle. As I mentioned, we're underway with NPF4 with our intention to publish a draft for consultation this September. On to regional spatial strategies. So we have this new requirement for authorities to set out strategic development priorities in regional spatial strategies, working together with others or not as they see fit. This also sees the removal of existing SDPs for the 4 largest city regions. These strategies won't themselves be part of the statutory development plan, but they will need to be taken into account in the preparation of both the NPF and LDPs. And there's a lot still to do to prepare for their formal introduction, wrapped up with the wider development planning package for implementation towards the end of next year. But meantime, and to support the current work on NPF4, authorities are currently exploring production of early indicative regional spatial strategies. And we're planning an event soon to share thinking on how that's going so far. There are some very substantial changes to come for LDPs, including how they might look with the NPF, with the SPP coming into the statutory development plan. On procedural changes, outgo main issues reports and income evidence reports, which need to pass a gate check before proceeding towards a proposed plan. There will be a requirement to take account of the NPF and local place plans, along with reflecting a range of policy issues that were added into the Act during the bill process in Parliament. And at the end of the process, through examinations, there have been a couple of options for reporters that were added at stage 3 of the bill. One, to recommend that the plan be amended early on once it's adopted, or the other is to return the whole plan to the authority to prepare a new plan if it has insufficient housing land allocated. The thinking here is that it should be the planning authority rather than the reporter who should be identifying development sites. Another important change is that each stage of the LDP preparation will require full council approval before it moves forward, so that should ensure sign-up to its delivery at full council level. I know there are some very difficult issues at the moment around transitional arrangements as we move from the old system to the new, and what that means for those ready to embark on their LDPs. This is being actively looked at with our development planning working group, and hopefully we'll have a clearer position coming on that very soon. So on to local place plans. You'll be aware local place plans are a new statutory opportunity for local communities to put across their aspirations for their areas, and that got a lot of attention during the parliamentary process. The idea behind this is that a community body can prepare a local place plan, which is its proposal for future development or use of land, and the body must give reasons why they think the LDP should be amended in line with it. We'll need to produce regulations to set out the procedural requirements. So far, we've been intentionally light touch on the requirements for local place plans so as not to put people off preparing these plans, and I suspect it will need to kind of stay that way. Planning authorities will need to invite communities to consider preparing local place plans and to take any into account in preparing your LDPs. And authorities also need to provide information on what assistance is available to community bodies. That doesn't mean a duty on authorities themselves to provide that assistance. It could come from a range of different sources. One vital resource here that we're going to have to make sure we get right is going to be in the guidance, or the toolkit that's produced and available to communities. There's a lot of interest in this from various organisations, and our community engagement working group has also helped think through possible detailed arrangements. We'll be looking to implement these provisions early next year. And a final point worth flagging on this is a requirement for us to carry out a review of the success of local place plans after 7 years, and that's 7 years starting from last summer. Master plan consent areas will replace the existing simplified planning zone provisions in the 97 Act. This was something that the independent panel were particularly keen on. The idea is that it places the planning authority in a stronger position for planning and incentivising investment and development by granting upfront planning permission and possibly some other development consents. There can't be master plan consent areas within certain protected sites, But unlike with SPZs, they won't be possible within green belts and conservation areas. There are currently 4 SPZs in place in Scotland. We've been supporting a few council pilots using the SPZ powers to deliver housing permissions recently, the first of which has just been adopted, so is one of the 4 that's now in place. With work on the other pilots ongoing, we want to see them completed and then apply our learning before we progress the master plan consent area provisions, so this is all scheduled for late next year. There are a fair number of standalone DM provisions in the Act, so I'll not talk through all of them, but just flag up a couple just now. There are to be changes to the arrangements for pre-application consultation on major developments. Applications will need to be lodged within 18 months of the proposal of application notice, and there's going to be a requirement for a second public event so that the developer can feed back to the community before making the application. And on repeat applications and the circumstances where an authority can decline to consider them, that period is going to increase from 2 years to 5 years. We also have to produce guidance to explain what would be a similar application and a significant change, so we'll be looking for help with that. Some of the DM provisions are already commenced, they're coming soon. You might see those in italics on this slide. The rest will come forward over the next year or so. On short-term control areas, this has been prioritised to progress this year. The Act enables authorities to designate areas where what could be termed commercial short-term letting of homes will always require a planning application. We know this is a particular issue in some pressured areas, but certainly not everywhere across Scotland. We'll need to produce regulations about the procedure before we can bring this into force, so we're preparing for a consultation that will come on that fairly soon. Not directly linked to this planning provision, you might be aware the Scottish Government is also preparing to bring in a licensing scheme for short-term lets next year, as well as having a look at the tax arrangements around them. It was a previous Planning Act that introduced the arrangements for local reviews in some circumstances instead of appeals going to the DPA, and that linked into planning authority schemes of delegation. The Act is going to roll this out further by adding other application types to those which can follow that route to local review. And there's scope for us to produce guidance on how schemes of delegation are working to ensure the more minor cases are being decided locally. We'll start work on this later this year and it will be implemented next year. The independent panel picked up on the complexity around arrangements for the duration of permission, and particularly for planning permission in principle. So the Act's going to return the duration to being set by condition, and that will allow the duration to be subject of a Section 42 application. It also sets a default 3 years for full permission or 5 years for permission in principle, but this also needs to be viewed with some flexibility. So for example, if it's known at the outset that development is unlikely to commence within the default period, the condition could be set to a more appropriate period, and we'll produce some guidance to support that. There are also some small changes being made to the arrangements for completion notices, and that's just to smooth that part of the process. On changes about planning obligations, there will be some flexibility added to remove the need to apply for a modification if all parties agree to that modification, or where there is an application, it will be possible to make a different modification to the one that was applied for. There are also going to be new arrangements for authorities to publish agreements and also to report with details about obligations that are still in place. So we'll get started on this in the spring to come into effect early next year. We have a requirement to produce guidance on the use of mediation in planning. The Act's provisions themselves are light touch when giving examples of aspects of the planning system that the guidance might cover. We do though have a requirement to produce this guidance within 2 years of royal assent, which was last July, so the clock is well and truly ticking on this one. This has been picked up as part of the community engagement package, while recognising that the use of mediation can extend beyond community interests. We're supporting an event to explore this next month, so you should see movement on this one coming fairly soon. There are changes being made to the fees regime as a result of the Act, but as existing, the main details of that are all set out in regulations and need to stay that way for flexibility. And as you know, we currently have that out to consultation. The Minister has been clear for some time that after the bill was over, we would look at fees again with a view to achieving full cost recovery. And so we're now moving this one on through that consultation. There are a few new options for fees too, so scope for discretionary charging for services, as well as potential in some circumstances for charging higher or lower fees, or potentially waiving the fee if appropriate. The consultation closes in the middle of next month, and we'll be looking to move forward very quickly towards regulations after the end of the consultation period. Always linked to discussions about fees, of course, is the matter of performance across the planning system. We had performance provisions in the bill at the start that were removed by amendments at stage 2, and then mostly returned in a slightly different form at stage 3. So planning authorities already produce annual performance reports voluntarily under the PPF arrangements. The Act puts reporting on a statutory footing, while recognising that performance can be measured in a number of different ways, including the quality of outcomes. And we'll be appointing Scotland's first National Planning Improvement Coordinator this summer. That person will provide advice not just to planning authorities about their performance, but also to others involved in planning in terms of how they play their parts. And that was an important distinction added in the provisions we brought back at stage 3. Drawing on the responses to the consultation, we'll continue to work with the high-level group on planning performance, including with COSLA, HOPS and the RTPI, in shaping the new performance reporting arrangements. On member training, this was also removed at stage 2 of the bill and returned at stage 3. It requires mandatory training and planning for elected members before they can sit in a committee making planning decisions. The detail of what that will involve will need to be set in regulations, and this one's going to come a bit later. Time to devise the training around the shape and requirements of the new planning system that we're currently working on, but also to be in place in time for the local government elections in spring 2022. And finally, the last part of the Act, we included provisions that would enable the future introduction of an infrastructure levy, but setting the detail of that in regulations. There's still a fair bit of work to be done on this, alongside consideration of any other options towards land value uplift capture, which was a particular issue during the bill's process. At the moment, we're taking stock of how existing mechanisms are working before exploring any new approaches any further. But we'll then bring forward a package for the next administration to consider, so that will come forward after the 2021 Scottish Parliament election. Worth mentioning, though, that infrastructure levy provisions include a sunset clause, so they will fall out of the Act entirely if not used within 7 years, and again, that clock's already ticking. So there's no shortage of work to do this year and beyond. I'll just finish off with a bit about how we're handling the various strands of work going forward. So first of all, we don't pretend to know all the answers. We need to draw on others' expertise. And no detailed legislation will just appear out of the blue. We've set up a number of multi-sector working groups to help us explore a range of issues. And we'll supplement that with targeted engagement of relevant stakeholders on individual issues. And we'll carry out public consultations before regulations are finalised and taken to Parliament. So there are going to be plenty of opportunities to inform thinking and help shape the new planning system. This slide just shows a breakdown of the different work packages being considered by the working groups. There's going to be some crossover in what they're looking at, where more than one group will need to look at particular issues. For example, the Community Engagement Group is looking at pre-application consultation, but so is the DM group. So there's opportunity for some of this to be interchangeable as we go forward. It's easy when we're delving into the inner workings of the system to fall into the trap of over-engineering processes, and that would kind of work against the whole intention of this planning reform package. So we're just asking everyone just to keep in mind the overall objectives of planning reform and those 6 priority outcomes that we kind of showed at the start of this. And also to think about the skills and the behavioural change that might help to deliver the new planning system, and what we might need to do to help each other through the transition as we start to get into new processes. And finally, to think about how we can make better use of digital opportunities. how we can better use data and technology in the new planning world, feeding into the digital strategy coming later this year. And within Scottish Government, our digital planning team are available to all groups and stakeholders as we're kind of thinking through how we make our new processes work. Okay, so I promise this is my final slide, and it's just a plug for how to keep in touch, and more importantly, how to be involved. You might have spotted earlier this month, we launched a new website, transformingplanning.scot. This is as a resource for information and opportunities as we take forward the reform programme, and also for our work on NPF4 and the digital strategy. And we'll be constantly adding new information to this site as we go. And we'll also provide our e-alerts and our blogs, and we'll tweet anything interesting and worth catching up on. So please do make sure you're signed up and following all of that, and the sort of links are there on this slide. So that's me done. I'll bring Trevor back in just now, and I look forward to any questions or reactions. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. Just as Andy said, we have around about half an hour for a Q&A session. As I said before, for those who may have missed the very start of the webinar, if you can please use the questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a pop-up option to write in questions. We're not only looking for questions. If your council or your key agency has already looked at potential ways to address some of the issues coming through the Planning Act implementation, please use this opportunity to share with us as well. Okay, I shall swiftly move to the first question. We have a question regarding the status of supplementary guidance, as it's no longer part of the development plan, and how this regards to development management determination.
Okay, right, that's a good one. And I suppose along with many of the answers I'm probably going to give over the next half hour, it's not an absolute black and white. There are still things to work out and how this plays out. But yeah, the statutory supplementary guidance will be removed when we take forward the package on development planning towards the end of next year. So it will no longer form part of the development plan. That doesn't mean you can't have supplementary guidance at all. It can still exist. It would exist as a material consideration rather than part of the development plan itself. So in terms of decision making, it will still have that kind of role to play. If it's relevant, it's relevant. No one's saying that it's knocked out altogether. The reason I'm kind of just not giving a 100% absolute answer on this is really around the transitional arrangements for how we handle this as well. Supplementary guidance is linked to existing LDPs. When we bring forward the new provisions, we need to think about how this fits in with the transitional arrangements as we move from existing LDPs going into the new form. And so just nailing down exactly where supplementary guidance will sit over that period after the legislation changes, but before the first round of LDPs are in place. And we'll work that out and talk that through with everyone.
It seems like a big issue.
It's a very big issue, yeah.
Okay, hopefully easier one to answer now. We've got a question regarding short-term lets. Do the regulations relate solely to dwelling houses, and does this include flats?
So how dwelling houses link up with flats in terms of how they're defined in the use classes order, I guess is where we're coming from here. So I would expect the intention here is it's a residential property. Now, what the Act does, it gives a bit of a definition of what's within scope, but it allows ministers to further define that in regulations. And we'll need to think about whether we need to do that and potentially whether we need to line up our definitions along with the work that's being done on the licensing scheme as well to nail that one down. So it's another where the answer is I'm not absolutely certain at the moment, but I would anticipate that we're talking about residential properties and not kind of separating out what is seen as a house or a flat.
Okay. Hopefully that answers your question. We have a question regarding further information expected on the format of regional spatial strategies. You did mention earlier on there's going to be an regional spatial strategies event coming soon.
Yes.
I don't know if that will help to define.
It hopefully will do, or at least it will help us. I mean, this is new to all of us, so we don't have a sort of predefined idea of what this must look like. It's another area that when we brought the provisions forward during the bill process, we were trying to be fairly light touch on the format. We don't want to dictate that. And if we'd kind of been too clear on what we were hoping for, even just during this kind of the work that's going on just now on the indicative regional spatial strategies, then that might have just guided folk in a particular direction, and we might have lost some of the opportunities to kind of try out different methods and kind of different innovations on how these can be taken forward. So our expectation is before we implement the statutory provisions in here, we'll bring forward, working with all authorities, we'll bring forward a set of guidance to see that through. That's further down the line for the work that's being done just now on the indicative strategies that will help the work on NPF4. That's why we're having this session coming up in, I think it's in a couple of months' time. So it's given authorities the opportunity to go and test out how they think they might want to do this. Authorities have been looking at who they want to work with and how they want to work together and what they might want to produce. So we'll get a bit of feedback on what people are thinking so far, and that might help just shape a bit of early guidance on how others might want to take that forward.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, in relation to the forestry and woodland strategies, should these come before or after the new local development plan?
Oh, I don't think I have a clear answer on that, and it's something I'll go back and contemplate with colleagues. It might be useful to have them. I know a lot of forestry and woodland strategies exist already, so whether we need to do something under the sort of statutory version before the next LDPs, I'm not sure. Maybe people who are on the other end of this will have a better idea, and it'd be worth getting feedback on that one.
Okay, we can certainly take this through the Heads of Planning Scotland as well as something to pick up further. The next question is, 2 seconds, I'm just having a wee technical issue here. Regarding the number of new duties for the local authorities in regard to the, sorry, let me rephrase this to how it's been written. With the number of new duties for local authorities and with regard to the findings of the financial memorandum, I'm not entirely sure what the full question is. If the question asker could please rephrase that, we'll come back to it in a little while, but we'll need to move on to the next one just for now. Question regarding the current permitted development right consultation on sustainability amidst hill tracks. Will this be reviewed separately from the main PDR consultation in the future?
Right, okay, so on hill tracks, so I suppose to start with the sustainability appraisal, and it identified a series of 16 different types of development or circumstances where we thought we could have another look at permitted development rights. We didn't have hill tracks on that at the time when we commissioned that work. And a lot of that was down to, it was only in 2014 was the last time that we reviewed the hill tracks PD and made some changes at that point. So it wasn't on our agenda at that point to take forward. It was quite clear though when the planning bill was before Parliament, there were some amendments were being put forward to try and put PD rights for hill tracks and define them on the face of the primary legislation, which is something we weren't comfortable with. So the Minister made a commitment during the bill process that we would bring this forward early after the bill was completed. So that's why it doesn't feature at all in the sustainability appraisal, but it is on our to-do list now to move forward early on a review of hill tracks PD.
Okay, hopefully that answers your question. We have a question on the wording used in the implementation document regarding the difference between have regard to and take account of.
Yes. That, even without knowing the context of where this is, that was something that was of great interest to the committee during stages 1 and 2 of the planning bill, and I remember it coming up in the context of local place plans and whether they should be taken account of or have regard to in the work on local development plans. I don't know if that's a context for this question, and we did kind of come forward with a stage 2 amendment just to change that terminology. I don't think there's a great deal of difference. If it's relevant, you're considering it anyway. So we've ended up in the legislation 2 different forms of words that I think mean broadly the same thing.
Okay. If anyone's got any legal feedback on that, it would be good to know this as well. Yeah. I've got a question regarding what are the latest thinkings regarding housing supply targets and how will that be set under NPF 4?
Someone had to ask that, didn't they? Latest thinking is we are still just exploring that, and a lot of the work that we're doing just now and the engagement that's about to start on NPF 4, and that'll be one of the questions we will be exploring in detail. So there is a requirement for us to include housing targets within the NPF. What that looks like, whether it drills down, is it all entirely about numbers, whether it drills down regionally or whatever, that's up for grabs at the moment. It's also something that the development planning working group are actively looking at too. So yes, we're aware this is a very big issue, and I'm sorry, it's another one I don't really have a clear answer on at the moment of what that's going to look like.
Okay, we've just had some feedback regarding the earlier on question about the financial memorandum. Right. The question asked us just asking for some comments on the duties. I don't know if you can share.
So I know from going through the bill process, even just producing a financial memorandum was something that we found very difficult because the bill itself and the primary legislation sets the overarching structure without the detail of how the system is going to work. We ended up with really wide-ranging ranges, I suppose, of what costs potentially could be, and asking people just to kind of help us out estimate what that might be. So kind of do recognise there are a lot of new duties. Some of the things that are new statutory duties were things that were already happening anyway, so whether or not there is a new cost that goes with them is something that's up for discussion. But yeah, there's no doubt there are things in there that we all need to find our way of funding as we go forward. In terms of where that funding comes from, I guess there are sort of different options, and I can't really answer that to any great extent just now, and particularly as we're going through a spending review and budgeting process, and authorities will be going through their budgeting as well. One of the things that we are really trying to press on, and I know it's something close to the RTBI's heart as well, is about getting over the value of planning. So when budgets are being set, if those who are making the decisions recognise that the achievements that planning can bring us and the impact that has on our society as a whole is worth investing in, and that's something we'll continue to pursue.
Yeah, I suppose that ties into the position of the Chief Planning Officer you mentioned before.
Absolutely. The
strengthened position of that within.
That's entirely about having that influence at the right place at the right time.
Okay, our next question is probably more specific. Someone's looking for an update on the changing place toilet provision for timescales for this.
For timescales, someone's probably picked up that in our work programme that was something we were going to do before the end of 2019, and it hasn't arrived yet. It is coming very soon. Even just this morning I saw a draft of the regulations arrive in my inbox, so I think we're nearly completed with that, and we'll go through our sign-off process, and that will come soon. What those regulations are going to be looking to do, if you see the provisions that went into the Act, they include definitions of what a changing places toilet would look like and what dimensions and things like that are involved, and also a definition of the types of developments that are going to be involved and included in that requirement. We also separately in building standards regulations, we have a building standard for changing places toilets, which doesn't align perfectly with what's in the Act. But when that amendment was being put in at stage 2 for the changing places toilets, we did have a discussion with the member who put it in, and we were grateful to get the agreement that we would include a provision that would allow us to use regulations to amend the provisions that are in the Act now, and that's what our regulations are going to do, really looking at sort of aligning the planning provisions with what's in building standards, and that'll come soon. Okay, next few weeks.
Okay, changing topic drastically again, we're going to go back to NPF 4. Someone's asking about the current call for ideas is looking towards more traditional NPF elements, and they're wondering what the scope is for input onto Scottish planning policy, or the policy aspects of this.
That's a great question. So next week's going to be a big week for us in NPF 4. We'll be publishing over the course of the week a range of things, sort of resources, and also kind of put further questions out. And one of the things that will be included in all of that is looking at what the existing policies are in the SPP and what people like about that and what they think might need to change. So that question is going to be asked very soon. Okay. And we'll be very grateful for as much input as possible on that to help us shape the policy.
Okay, and again, I'm sure this is something that will go to Ops as well, so we will have the contact with local authorities in that manner. Our next question, sorry, I'm having a slight technical, it's jumping just now, bear with me. Good question regarding what happens if a community objects to the proposed LDP in 2020 on the basis that they want their local place plan to be included in the LDP to be adopted in 2021. We will, I was going to cover this at the end, we have quite a few questions regarding local place plans. Sure. We will be looking at this in more detail in a webinar next week. So Andy might not be able to answer this question in detail, but I'll
so I can just clarify again just what the question is.
It's regarding if a community objects to a proposed LDP this year, right, and how that would be adopted in 2021 if they want the LDP to be included. Sorry, the local place plan to be included.
Right, okay. So is this for, obviously some communities have already produced their own local place plans. They're not what we would call statutory local place plans in terms of what's in the new Act. I would still expect them to be sort of material. There would still be a suggestion of what the community's aspirations are. So if this is an LDP being taken forward at the moment, I would say you still at least want to take a look at these local place plans and think about what aspects of them you think might be relevant to consider for your LDP, or certainly worth thinking why you maybe wouldn't be adopting some parts of that too. This would still just work as any other representation in your LDP. It could potentially lead to objections and be considered at examination. So although they're not statutory at the moment, I would say ignore them at your peril.
Okay, I think just to confirm, we will be covering this in more detail next week, and I'll speak at the end about the local place plan webinar. We have a next question we've got is, do you consider recent HNDAs to be required to feed into NPF 4 housing targets?
I think this comes into the answer I gave previously on housing targets and how we actually handle that, and that's something that's being discussed. And I'll admit I'm not too close to that myself anyway to be able to give a reliable answer where we are in terms of handling the targets. There'll be a lot of information out there, and I know there's kind of a lot of discussion as well just around how one does work. And whether there's any further guidance needed on some of this, but I'm not close enough to be able to give a definitive answer. So I'll rely on what I said earlier around how the housing targets for the NPF are going to look is very much still up for grabs.
Okay. Our next question is looking to when any potential changes to the PPF are likely to be brought forward. This ties into the current consultation that's out till the middle of next month, looking at fees and performance, and the performance coordinator likely to be brought in. I'll let Andy speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I suppose there's that kind of look at what we already have as a performance framework and how that might look under what would be the new statutory performance framework. So the PPF has evolved over the years. I've always enjoyed watching this one closely because I did work closely with Hobson on devising the very first version of it, so it's good to see how that's been moving along. But yeah, it's going to have a sort of new statutory status. And we'll have to have a look at whether that is a reinvention of the PPF or if it's something entirely different. That's all going to be something we'll discuss very closely with the high-level group on planning performance. And for folk who maybe haven't seen that, and that's a kind of group that is co-chaired between the Minister and with COSLA. And kind of looks at all aspects of performance and also how it links into the resources angle as well. Place for that on that for the key agencies group too. So that's the group that's going to sort of be more closely involved. Also within our working groups, we have the leadership skills and resources group is also working with us closely on how that might shape up. So for what that might mean for the future of the PPF and what that looks like. I would just reiterate the point though that we at least have set in the legislation that outcomes for what planning is actually producing is something that we would envisage is going to be a key part of how we look at how planning is performing in the future, not just planning authorities, but planning as a whole. On the coordinator, so the role of the coordinator, we've said we'll appoint someone, we're planning to do that just around the summer. The role of the coordinator is something that we're also just asking for a bit of a view on in the consultation at the moment. And again, probably just repeating myself, but reiterating that point, that the coordinator is going to have a really crucial role in looking at what practice works well in planning authorities, but not just authorities, everybody who's involved in the planning system. We do recognise that although authorities are the leaders of their planning services locally, there are a lot of other influences in how others play their part. And it's a sort of important distinction now for the coordinator to be able to get involved and advise others as well. What we're looking at is improvements everywhere we can on how the planning system improves, not just how planning authorities improve.
Okay. I can probably add to this as well. Like, there's not going to be any changes this year to the PPFs as they currently stand.
Yeah, but, and that makes sense.
It's a future thing that's going to be happening.
Yeah.
Our next question is, given the importance of the role of the LDP gate check, will the Scottish Government be updating policy and or guidance in the replacement of Scottish planning policy?
Right, sorry, I'm kind of not quite catching. So we won't be updating what's in the Scottish planning policy, so yes. And that will become part of the development plan when we adopt the NPF. So yeah, that will become development plan policy, and it will can have some implications for what will then need to appear in LDPs as well. In terms of guidance on all of this, I can't imagine we're going to be able to bring forward the new development planning provisions without having sort of very clear line and ideas of what that's going to look like. So I've absolutely no doubt there will be a refreshed circular, there will be guidance that will come with this on how the whole LDP process will play out. And again, it's not something we'll just prepare ourselves in isolation. So there's a lot of work to be done on how LDPs will work and how they might look in the future. And yeah, that will just be left to authorities to make that up by themselves, so with the guidance there.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Okay, I've just said one. I think we answered this question, but just during the presentation itself, someone's looking for transitional arrangements for LDPs. I think there's already discussion with the Scottish Government and some local authorities on this. I don't know if we can say any more at this point.
I don't think we can. I know some of my colleagues put out a paper to HOPS a while back and got a bit of feedback from that, and that has kind of sparked a lot of the discussions that are going on at the moment. I would be lying if I told you I kind of knew where this was actually going at the moment. I know there are a number of people in deep discussion about how this goes, but I also recognise there's a certain urgency around that as well, with a number of authorities sitting thinking, do we start our next LDP or not, or where do we go with it? So we do recognise the urgency on this, and we'll get something out as soon as we possibly can.
Okay. I'm realising we're getting very close to time. I've just got probably one final question here regarding member training. Has there been any look at what format it's going to take? If it's going to be similar to licensing, or if there's similar formats elsewhere, either in the UK or other countries? Has this been...
Not greatly, although recognise we're not starting from scratch. Member training already happens, it's just not required in statute at the moment. So I mean, that can certainly be our starting point, is understanding what already happens and what training is available, and can start picking from that. But the thinking on this really does have to be done alongside the changes that are being made to the system, and also the changes that are being made through policy, through the NPF as well, about what the priorities might need to be. Purely by speculating, and taking forward the NPF, and there's no doubt that climate change is a major issue for the NPF and for planning as a whole going forward. So whether there's an element of that feeds its way into how that links into planning for the training or not. It may not just be process-based training. There might be scope to go in lots of different directions. I don't have a firm opinion on what that should look like, but it's something that will certainly take lots of opinions as we go forward. So we have just intentionally parked that to some extent until we've got a clearer picture of what the new system is going to look like, and what we hope the influence of planning is going to be coming through the new system, and we'll build the training around that.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I think we're coming close to the end of our time. So, as I said before, Andy has put his lots of links in his presentation, which will be sent out, including his email. If you've got any particular questions you want to send direct to the Scottish Government, they can be directed to other people within it. So, the next steps for us following this webinar is I will be forwarding to all the sign-ups a copy of a PDF of the presentation, and the video will shortly be edited and put on the Partners in Planning website, and including links to contacts, including myself. At the end, once I stop speaking, there'll be a few questions that will pop up on your screen, mostly just for other topics you might want to, if there's any issues you want to cover in more detail that might have been raised today. The big one is local place plans. There's been quite a few questions that I've not asked, because I think they would be better directed towards our next webinar, which is next Wednesday morning, looking at local place plans with the Scottish Community Development Centre and Nick Wright Planning, who have been doing some research on behalf of the Scottish Government, which is due for publication fairly soon. So we can take those questions there. That again will be recorded and broadcast. But thank you all for tuning in today. Just when I sign out, you'll get a few pop up. It'd be very much appreciated if you could fill in the questions. And if you have any other issues, just please get in touch with me. As I said, I'll be emailing out, so please get in touch and let me know any more thoughts. And thank you from me.
And yeah, thank you from me too. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thanks everyone. Cheers. Goodbye.